Cambridge Arts Roundup with Simon Bertin.
Cambridge Radio.
Hello, I'm Simon Bertin, and I hope you've got a head for heights, because in this programme we'll look at perfection in sculpture, questions of philosophy, artificial intelligence and art, and then sample the documents that laid the foundations for discipline in medicine, albeit somewhat curiously. In this edition, we encounter local sculptor Ian Wolter at his new exhibition Perfection, Exploring Perfection in the Human Condition at the Wightman Gallery at Llanfair End, and contemplate the profound and complex nature of being human. We then explore the philosophical issues of artificial intelligence and art with Philosophy and Interdisciplinary Studies Fellow at Fitzwilliam College, Associate Professor Dr. Alex Carter, who I'm pleased to say has no small gift for making mind-boggling subjects intelligible. And we drop in on Dr. James Freeman, Medieval Manuscript Specialist at Cambridge University Library, to view manuscripts which detail how people approached the medicinal in medieval times in an exhibition Curious Cures in Cambridge Libraries. Capturing the beauties, truths and subtleties we notice in the uninhibited adult at an intimate and unguarded moment, revealing the secrets of their grace and nature in sculpture, is something few artists can do well. Sculptor Ian Wolter's new exhibition Perfection, Exploring Perfection and the Human Condition is currently running at the Wightman Gallery at Llanfair End near Saffron Walden. Working primarily in figurative sculpture, Wolter's practice challenges conventional narratives, inviting audience to reconsider notions of truth, memory and the human condition. His sculptures are earning critical recognition for their engagement with contemporary discourse. Notably, he won the Art Laguna Prize in Venice and Rom Art Sculpture Prize in Rome in 2022. Gallery owner Annabelle Wightman introduces the work, which I thought was astonishingly good.
I'm Annabelle Wightman, and I've started an art gallery here called Wightman Gallery at Compass Courtyard, and we've been open for 1 year, and we're an independent space, and we showcase long-term collaborations with artists. We work with them on their material, their process, and we run a programme of exhibitions and workshops throughout the year. Our exhibition is called Perfection. Natalie Lagrosse she's an art writer, and we wanted her to write a piece about the pursuit of perfection. So she's written this quite dense essay, academic essay about our ideals of perfection. What does it look like anatomically to us? Our thinking has shifted perhaps into what we feel is perfect. So with the body, with the human body, Ian has grappled with the proportion of the body in a different scale now, because obviously, as we know him as a public artist, his accolades to major institutions in the country are growing year by year. Oxford University, Harwich, the National Army Museum, and now very much in East Anglia, because this is Ian's home territory. So we have a very exciting sculpture trail to offer the public now. So this exhibition really focuses in on perfection, which is inspired by Da Vinci's The Vitruvian Man, which he drew in 1490. And Da Vinci was inspired by Vitruvius, the Roman architect, who was looking at proportion, how the human body was directly related to architecture, hence the square and circle around the figure. So what Ian has done, he's reimagined this drawing by Da Vinci, but he's concerned about theme, Ian. So his social historical passion or related to the fact that he's reimagining something that he feels is an injustice, or perhaps there's a moving on from that single man figure alone. And so Ian has his own personal view on that. There is this kind of romance to figurative sculpture, classicism that we all understand. But I think what's special about this work is that there's a fragility and there's an elegance and a performative sense of like the suspension, of how these two figures are interplaying. But you're absolutely right. The skin, it's very much, you're just on the surface of the skin. You can feel these bodies. You can really sense their physiques in a way, and touching each other, and how sort of respectful it is, and yet the power of it, the energy comes through.
Ian, we're standing looking at the centre of this show, an absolutely wonderful artwork. Tell me a little bit about it, because it's got some really great ideas behind it.
So this is called Vitruvian, and it's named after the very famous drawing by Leonardo da Vinci of what purported to be the perfect proportions of a human. But of course it was only a male human, and Vitruvius believed that those proportions could transfer to architecture. And I was interested in that drawing really not because of what Leonardo intended or Vitruvius intended, but it was the fact that it was chosen to be shot into space on, I think it was the Voyager probe. So it's the only drawing to have left Earth, to have left our solar system. And so it was chosen to represent humanity. And of course, it couldn't. It only represents, at the very most, half of humanity. So my sculpture features a man and a woman back to back, but each turning to look at the other. So they're aware of each other, they're intimate. But from either side, it looks very like Leonardo's drawing. So it has the circle and square around them.
It seems to capture a very beautiful, naked, sensitive and vulnerable feeling, with their buttocks touching, with their arms spread out in the full glory of the human body. And this was based on some real people that you sculpted around.
Yes, I always work from life. And these two models they're both fantastic. They're both dancers, they both have phenomenal physiques. But it's also helpful if you get on with them. You spend a lot of time with these people in your studio, and these are people I like very much. The pose with their arms out wide is very open. It's very it's a very intimate sort of sculpture, isn't it?
It is. I mean, it's also it has a sexual feeling to it as well, but it's not. It's like a dry and pure type of feeling, completely elegant and dignified. It also shows off the glory of the body.
So this was the first sculpture I made in this body of work. There are 9 sculptures in the show, and this one I was really thinking about an ancient Greek idea of perfection in sculpture, whereby the surface of the sculpture, the skin, represents the tension of the muscles, the sinews, the tendons, the bones inside, but also the emotion and the morality of the subject. So with this piece, what I wanted to do was to give you all of those clues, so you can see the tension in his muscles, you can see his head, as you say, slightly looking down and to one side, and his fingers are splayed. So is he listening to music? Is he transported by some otherworldly force? So it's deliberately vague. It's deliberately for you to try to decide what he's doing.
How much does the idea that true perfection is flawed come into it? Because you need the flaw for emotion to exist, I think, according to Aristotle.
That's right.
And basically, he looks as though, in one sense, he's splendid and powerful and possibly even flying to some extent. And the other sense is that he's like a spiritual ghost to some degree. His eyes look sad, slightly gaunt, and he's also beholding something, perhaps even. So you've got like all of those kind of elements in it, which I think it's quite remarkable. Now, what were you working with here in order to get this wonderfully dappled surface to the bodies, to make them so delicate and splendid?
So I work in clay, and as I say, from life. So I have a model in the studio, and these figures are all half life size. And I always think half-life size looks a lot smaller than half-life size. But yes, I'm working in clay with wooden tools, so probably in exactly the same way as someone did in ancient Greece or in the Renaissance in Italy. This hasn't changed. And it was cast into bronze. The sculpture you see is made of bronze. And that was cast via the lost wax method. So again, that was invented or discovered perhaps by the ancient Greeks, as well as other civilizations around the world.
Now, there's a philosophical aspect to this exhibition as well. What is that?
The whole show is really me thinking around ideas of perfection. So this one, I'm not saying at all that it's a perfect sculpture. It's a sculpture about perfection. And so this one really probes that ancient Greek idea. The Leonardo one is really not about the Renaissance, it's about that decision by NASA to represent humanity, perfection in humanity, in the way they did.
There's also this idea that there is architecture in the frame that goes around, yes, that they have to fall within, which I suppose is an allusion to the captivity of the divine imagination, basically, isn't that?
Well, exactly. And when Leonardo da Vinci made his drawing on the ideas of Vitruvius, he put them in a square and a circle, and that was to denote perfection. But when you see it made of steel, it becomes restrictive. So it's the strictures around.
It's something about order and discipline, and then the circularity of life and all those other things like that kind of come together in that
yeah,
way.
It's
and these beautiful angel-like, these are torsos, and they have beautiful angel wings on them. Tell me about this.
So the first one here was inspired by Nike, torso with broken wings in the Louvre in Paris. So the pose is contrapposto. So this hip is raised and this shoulder is raised and she's twisted. So that's been a very popular thing since the Renaissance. So they're all to some degree that sort of pose. So why wings? So here I'm thinking about divine perfection. So it's just another way of thinking about perfection.
It's part of the idea to create a spiritual energy in the sculptures, so that you can actually have a feeling of them having quite a deep substance to them. That goes right back to heaven, basically. Through the heart, the body, the feelings, the spirit. All of those things. The soul.
I think yes. I mean, certainly these are unmistakably a Christian iconography, but I think with any of these sculptures, these are of a scale to be in your home. They're not garden sculptures. And so I would hope that all of them are capable of, a deep emotional connection with them. I think when you buy art, I don't know about you, some things we've bought over the years I've fallen out of love with, and they get relegated. They move to guest rooms and things like that. Other pieces become cherished friends, and I hope these will find good homes. And I think they are things you can imbue with emotion.
And what about the intellect? Because this figure seems very much to be a thinking man.
Yeah.
Something is permeating him, and he's enjoying the experience.
Yeah, he's almost physically lifted,
savouring it, and
he's up on
transported by it.
Yeah. Yes, and the patination on this sculpture is very different to the others. The others are largely penny bronze, which is the most typical, and this one, of course, is a smoky grey. Which is much harder to achieve, but I love it. I love this, and I'm going to do more of this.
So, what about this wonderful sculpture here? I see you've got something beautiful in the courtyard.
So, in the courtyard, there is an edition of The Children of Calais, which is permanently installed in Saffron Walden next to St Mary's, the big church. But this is a second edition of it, which I made to enter a competition in London. And shall I tell you the story of it, how it came about? Or?
So it's based on Roundup, isn't it?
That's right.
And the burghers of Calais, was it? Who were some prisoners or something. And this reflects the plight of the children suffering in Calais.
The victims of the migrant crisis.
Yeah.
And it came about some years ago because our MP at the time said some very odious things about child migrants. His view was that even if children in Calais had a legal right to come to the UK or had family here, they still shouldn't be allowed in because that would just encourage more to come. That was his view. And so I seethed about that. Eventually came up with this idea of responding in sculpture, which is, I guess, what a sculptor does. And I thought with my wife actually about, what's the artistic thing that comes to mind when you think of Calais? And of course it's The Burghers of Calais by Rodin. And that sculpture was created to commemorate a moment in the 100 Years' War when the English laid siege to the city of Calais. They'd besieged the city for a year. They'd run out of food, they were eating shoe leather, it was dire straits. And eventually they sued for peace, for parley. And the English king said, OK, we'll spare the people of the city if you send me your 6 most senior burghers, and they must come ready with nooses around their necks and with the keys to the city. And so they walk out of the gates to their certain death. They're going to be hanged in front of the city. The English queen, however, was pregnant, and she said that would bring terrible bad luck to our unborn child. So because of her, the burghers' lives were spared. So Rodin created this sculpture at the moment when they're walking to their certain death, and it's a work of genius. The 6 figures are all lost in despair. They're very, very close together, but they don't touch each other, they don't look at each other. They are all lost in despair, and they express it in 6 different ways. So what I did for the children of Calais, was take those poses and those emotions, those expressions, and replace the burghers with British children.
No, you actually used real children in order to sculpt those.
One of them is my daughter.
So you covered them in clay or something, or what?
No, but I sculpted them from life.
From life,
so the children, one by one.
I thought you'd use latex moulds or something like that. Or
no, my daughter at the time was 6, I think, and she couldn't have stood still enough to be moulded.
This last piece, the woman.
Yeah, Natalie Bertelsmann-Legros wrote an essay about this group of sculptures. And what she said about this is that you, the viewer, meet her, or rather she meets you on equal terms. She can, you catch her eyes. So there's no voyeurism here. She's not a victim.
And she's appealing as well.
It's a beautiful thing. And when because this one also is a torso, so when I removed the arms in the wax stage, it left holes, and so I could have filled those holes, but I think this is really like the fetishization of ancient Greek sculptures by the Romans. They would dig them up, and that's where the love of torsos comes from, because they found incomplete sculptures. And so the fact that she has holes looks like she's much older than she is.
But she's not a goddess.
No.
And that's interesting. Wonderful. Ian, thank you so much indeed for showing me around. These are really amazing sculptures. And tell me about when the exhibition runs and where people can find it.
So the exhibition is at the Wightman Gallery, which is at Compass Courtyard, which is one of these farmyards that's been developed into a restaurant, a bread shop, and an art gallery, and so on, just outside Saffron Walden. The show runs till mid-May, so 2.5 months.
Cambridge Arts Roundup with Simon Bertin.
This is Cambridge Radio.
If artificial intelligence to you is something strange and incomprehensible, and that possibly sends a shiver through your creative spine, what you might need is the help of a good philosopher who can explain the issues in bite-sized digestible chunks, and that otherwise a jungle python like me might struggle with for days. Well, I headed off to visit an erudite mind in the hope of some clarity in the form of fellow and academic lecturer at Fitzwilliam College, Associate Professor Dr. Alex Carter, who says AI isn't going to be the monster we make it out to be.
Typically, AI is thought of as a replication of human thinking, and I want to be very clear, that is not my view. My view is that AI doesn't think like us, it thinks like we think, which is a hyper-rationation. I know that. It's a lot of very complex ideas that philosophy is bringing in, but the idea is basically that we don't understand how we actually think. So we're replicating outputs, not processes or inputs.
Okay, so it's becoming increasingly embedded in the arts sector, and basically it's going to be the next industrial revolution, isn't it? It's going to be something that people will need to, in some way, understand its implications. What do you think? This kind of change will raise in terms of fundamental questions of authorship, originality, ethical responsibilities in AI-generated art?
Oh, so there's a whole nest of ideas lurking in there. So let's start firstly by saying, is it necessarily the next industrial revolution? Because I'm not certain that it is. We keep hearing, so Elon Musk recently used the phrase that he's expecting electric cars to have a ChatGPT moment where they suddenly start driving themselves. The problem I have with the idea of a ChatGPT moment is, have we had another one since? And aren't we really we were bamboozled by it initially, but now we see that actually there are some problems here. There's hallucination, there's simplicity, there's replication. So ChatGPT isn't like other industrial revolutions. It's not necessarily bringing about new things. It is, however, highly commercial. So it is incredibly valuable, and that speaks to your point about intellectual property. Now, interestingly, I didn't ever think about my philosopher of choice's view on intellectual property until a student got interested in it. So my philosopher of choice is Wittgenstein. And he talks about intellectual property in a very unusual way, because he doesn't believe that our ideas originate in our heads and then get spat out into the world. Our ideas originate in the world and get subsumed by us in activity. So the point that I derive from this is, when a student asked me, what do you think Wittgenstein's views are? I said, well, I would imagine they would be something like ideas are public first, private second. So all intellectual property is theft. And he does make suggestions to this point. Even in the 1930s, 40s and 50s, Wittgenstein is indicating that his view is ideas have value, but they don't have value because you gave them that value. They have value because they have value to society and you derive them from society. So there is a kind of tragedy of the commons, which is the idea that if you keep taking out of a common resource, you'll eventually deplenish it to the point where no one can get anything from it. There is that sense that that's what we're doing with intellectual property. So it may be that AI delivers us to a point where we get the correct view, which is that you can't own ideas. Which is a terrible thing for me to say, by the way, because my entire career is premised on the ownership of ideas. But here I am saying them out into the world without any expectation that people will respect that they came from me. Do I care? No, because again, I want to have those ideas understood and thought about and rejected, maybe, if they're wrong.
For anyone creative, that this whole notion that something that you came up with can be expropriated by a company, can be taken away from you, and really, that feeling of kind of, oi, that was my idea. Therefore, all the money attached to that idea should really go to me, as an artist or a creative person. And since in today's world nobody's really sharing anything, if you come up with a gold nugget of some sort, the AI seems to be the mechanism which will deprive you of all of its value in monetary terms in the world.
But there's also a question about which ideas we protect. So, for instance, the first novel, the first painting, they didn't establish the existence of novels and painting as a technology that I can own. The first farmer didn't say, if you farm, you owe me the intellectual property of farming. So there are questions about what actually counts as intellectual. And once you get into that sort of minutiae of questions about what actually can be assigned ownership and value and so on, you start to realize there's not a lot here really, that we're building the distinctions ourselves. So yes, you can create, and yes, I obviously as an academic and someone who works exclusively in the realm of ideas, I want ideas to be attributed to the person who originated them. But do we originate them? I have to say, philosophically speaking, and here's where my idea destroys my own ownership of my ideas, I don't think you can. I don't think you can claim that I came up with that idea. Again, I alluded to my student and I alluded to Wittgenstein. So this is an ongoing conversation, and Wittgenstein didn't draw it from just anywhere. He didn't make it out of nothing.
Shoshana Zuboff, who's a Harvard academic, suggests that in her theory of surveillance capitalism, that basically what the new model of the world over valuable things is to seize free resources, monopolise them, and then tell people that they've got to pay for them. And if those resources are coming from a particular person, then you get into a terrible argument, really, don't you? Saying that the ideas are free, because they certainly weren't free if they are the result of years of practiced art and study and what have you, and especially when they're going to be exploited to a huge degree. That sort of creates a lot of, obviously all the artists in America are saying, well, we don't want to have ourselves copied digitally and all the rest of it, or we don't want to be controlled by AI thinking, all of those other things. What would you say about all of those fears?
So I think some of the fears get generated by the realization that an idea does have value. So my point is, we don't preserve the ownership of all ideas, period. We preserve the ideas that then seem to have value. And I've got a wonderful example of this. I was watching an old review of the film Suicide Squad. Not a great film, although the remake was quite interesting. But there's a character in it, and the commentators made this point. They said, Polka Dot Man, which is the superhero in that film, or the supervillain maybe, depending on your view, was not someone anyone saw as having value. And there are a vast number of superhero characters that have fallen into the public domain because no one sees them as having value. And there's been a project by a group of people to sort of reclaim these ideas and give them an assigned value. Suddenly then, ownership matters. And so going out and finding these kind of lost ideas is meritorious, but only when they become valuable do we then start worrying about ownership. And that seems backwards to me. We don't seem to worry too much about where ideas are coming from in conversations and so on. So if we're intellectually honest about this, we have to recognise that there's a compromise being delivered somewhere. Questions around, is AI an artist or is it a paintbrush? Is it a tool? Is it a means by which we create art? I have to believe that most AI is just a tool that we're using to make the art we want. Typically, and I've done this myself, if you want to create an AI image, what you do is you give it a description, you say, no, that's wrong, you give it another one, you tweak it, and eventually you get the image that you're looking for. You haven't designed every element of that, but you have at least sort of guided it and then said, yes, that's what I was looking for. Now, I find that incredibly tedious, by the way, and actually I find it much easier just to create the images myself, ultimately. But if AI were to get to the point where we're just asking it for something and it's delivering it, we're not asking the AI, we're asking a platform, a tool, a set of engineers. I would still want to track it back to the human. And this is where we get into a deep dive of philosophy. And I just want to explain why I said that I don't think AI thinks like us. We don't think like AI. AI might think like us in the sense that it has a kind of metaphorical or analogous relationship to how we think. But it is only one direction. We can't start with logic. We don't begin there. We are biological first, logical second. AI is logical first, logical second, logical third, and so on and so on. And the logic that it has was given to it by us. It can't ever surprise us with a genuinely new logical structure. We've given it that. If it surprises us, it's just because we made a mistake. We gave it the wrong logic. And this connects with another idea, which I think is central to art: criticism. we aren't critiquing the AI. We're critiquing the people who build the AI, if anything. There's no criticism here. It doesn't put it out and go, do you think it's any good? It just puts it out and says, does this satisfy the parameters that you requested? That's not art. That is at best, there's a wonderful film called Never Look Away, which is, the original title is German and it's much better, which is Werk ohne Autor, Work Without an Author. And this film is all about creativity, and in that he's moving from an East German world where you're told what to paint to a West German world where you just go, ich, it's all about me, I've got to find my art. And what he does is he synthesizes those two things to the removal of the author. Now, what happens to AI art if you remove the AI itself? Nothing. You get nothing. But that's exactly what Jackson Pollock was trying to do when he did his drip paintings. He was trying to remove himself. This is also what Damien Hirst is doing with his spot paintings. He's trying to remove himself. The author, the creator, can't be in the created object. It's a kind of renunciation. It's an allowance of something else to come to be. An AI can't do that because it is the purest expression of thinking. It only creates by thinking. We create by trying not to think. We fail, of course, otherwise the art wouldn't exist. Trying not to create and then failing. But you can't program an AI to try not to create and then fail to do so. Doesn't make sense.
To what degree do you think we can actually trust AI as this thing which is something that has been constructed through how we think? Why should we not trust that as being reasonably accurate?
So we can absolutely trust it from one point of view. So, for instance, most of what I do, I don't think about. And here is where a cognitivist, right, a psychologist who believes that everything that I'm doing is explained by looking inside my brain will say, oh, no, you're wrong. There is some thinking going on. But then have they collapsed the distinction between me thinking the verb and me thinking the noun? So thinking the verb and thinking the noun are clearly two different things. AI has thinking the noun, but it does not have thinking the verb. If I'm going to talk about thinking the verb, it's my awareness of my thinking, my direction of my thinking. So there's a very famous experiment called the Libet experiment, where a psychologist proved that before you are even aware that there's a decision in front of you, your brain has made the decision. And this is the most inane scientific experiment I've ever heard, and I don't know why it became famous. It became famous largely because of mistakes in its design, which have been corrected, but that correction is also inane, because the whole hypothesis is false. The idea that my brain thinks for me is makes about as much sense as the idea that my larynx speaks for me. It doesn't make sense to talk that way. Why? There's a semantic shift between the causes of my thinking and me thinking and what my thoughts are. The agency and the causality don't work together. That's not to say that I'm a dualist and that I'm suggesting that our mental existence is separate from our physical existence. I'm saying that semantically, grammatically, and you are using words whenever you talk about this stuff, semantically and grammatically, it doesn't make sense to collapse one into the other. And that's what AI is. It's the collapsing of activities that we do. Perfect example of this, an AI can beat me at a game of chess. I suspect it could have done that in 1972. So, an AI will always beat me at chess. But the problem with that is the AI doesn't enjoy the chess, it doesn't dislike the chess, it's not interested in playing chess, and the progress we've made in designing an AI that enjoys chess is nil, zero, none whatsoever. I do not think AI is an agent. Any agency it gets comes from us. Why? Because we're motivated, we have biological drives and needs and psychological drives as a result. Because of its purely logical structure, it's an abstraction, and therefore it's an abstraction of someone else's needs. It must be premised upon something else. And I want to be clear here, this isn't just a question of dependency. So some people have likened this problem to the problem of the idea that if God created us, then we don't really have free will or agency. Because if God created me to sin, why is he now judging me for sinning? And I would say the bit more interesting question there is the aesthetic, ethical judgment there. It's not so much that I lack free will, it's that the thing that created me to be exactly the way I am right now is now judging me for the way I am. That's why I'm saying criticism doesn't exist for the art, the AI-generated art. There's no criticism involved in that, except to say, oh, I don't think that that's really creating worthwhile art. in which case that's a criticism of the people who've built the AI, not the AI itself.
If God is going to drop us into this reality and give us free will, and what he's saying is you can neither be good or bad, but it's up to you to choose which path you take in each one of your decisions. Is that same proposition being given to AI?
So interestingly, I do have fairly strong views on this. I'm a philosopher of religion, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, that. So St. Paul's letter to the Romans is a very interesting example of this, where he says, God has created you a vessel of wrath or a vessel of grace. So you've been made the way you are. You're either wrathful or graceful. That's what you are. But you're still responsible, he says. And how does this make sense? Well, it makes sense in the way I just articulated, right? The idea of creativity as a becoming, as a process that we're constantly engaged in dynamically. And this will circle back to AI, I promise. So there's a wonderful term that's used by Deleuze, which is the idea of constant genesis. T.S. Eliot didn't know he was T.S. Eliot, by which we mean he didn't know that he was the great poet T.S. Eliot when he was writing his poems. He had to create that on the basis of almost a faith in oneself, a becoming. There wasn't a state of being T.S. Eliot. And AI is a state of being something. So for instance, they created an AI that could replicate, or rather generate, Vivaldi-esque music. You could equally create an AI that would create T.S. Eliot-esque poems, but it would be a static object. And I know what people are going to say, but it learns and it develops. It doesn't learn, it gets updated, it gets more information. That's not the same thing as learning. But so the point I'm making is, it's not in a state of becoming. It is what it is at any given moment. At a snapshot of time, an AI is perfectly accounted for by the code and the data comprising it. A person is not. Why? Because there is no person at any given moment. What thoughts occur in a given instant of time? If you hit pause on the universe right now, how many thoughts are existing? None whatsoever, except thought in the sense of the noun, i.e. brain activity, AI activity. But there wouldn't be a consciousness of thought.
Marxists fear that machines will be replacing humans for physical work, and develop human intelligence replacing human mental work, and the effect of AI on human art is triggering debates.
I agree with the Marxists. I understand the Marxist concern. There is a sense in which we are being replaced by AI, but interestingly, we're doing it willfully, and we're doing it not by making AI as good as us, but by making ourselves significantly worse than we were previously. A good example, Nietzsche said, and I'm quoting a colleague here who said that he said this, Nietzsche allegedly said, technology makes us more powerful, but makes us less mighty. What he means by that is, my phone can remember 1 billion numbers, 1 trillion numbers, phone numbers that is. Back in 1989, I could remember 6 or 7, but I can't remember any now. I don't store phone numbers in my head at all. I can't find my way about using a map anymore, because I've just got sat-nav. I'll just ask my phone to direct me. So the idea of I can get anywhere now, but that's not just by me. If you turned off the technology, I'd be less capable, not more capable. So there's this kind of trading off, and it's what I call the race to the middle, where human beings are, to some extent, getting worse as a result of AI. A good example of that would be the Google effect on the brain, where I can't solve a problem, but I can look up the answer, and I'm getting much better and quicker at doing that. Meanwhile, AI is getting better, but only better insofar as it's causing that effect on us.
What happens when AI art encounters two fundamental things that make art genuine or authentic, which is orientation towards the concept of death, which is absolutely central to all art, and secondly, the je ne sais quoi, which is attached entirely to human understanding. Because if you make this departure into computer-generated art, you lose those two factors which define things as art in terms of being recognisable to a living human being. And if you have that problem, what is AI going to do with that? Because it can't conceptualise that. It's a very difficult thing to get your head around.
So interestingly, here I'm going to defend AI and say, actually, that's not a problem for AI. I think AI has as good, if not better, chance of understanding death than we do. Ask a person about death. How many times have you died? Oh, 0. well, then what do you know about experiencing death? Well, I've experienced the fear of my death. Okay, and how does that articulate itself? Oh, it articulates itself in the following way, and then they articulate it. They say it, and that statement that gets written down, it gets put on the internet, it gets canonized and established as the data that goes into generative AI, regenerative AI, we should call it. But anyway, so the AI can encompass vast cultural differences between attitudes towards death, as long as they're expressed. Now, what you might say is, what about the inexpressible? Well, art is meant to capture, to some extent, the inexpressible aspects of mortality and so on, and eternity and all these sorts of things. Interestingly, death and eternity do align very neatly with each other, and AI arguably doesn't have mortality, so it could well represent this. Here's a good example. Albert Camus, when he tried to articulate what the human condition is and our mortality, what did he use? An immortal to reflect that. Sisyphus. He lives forever, and he repeats the same task over and over again. Sounds like an AI to me, right? So an AI might be the perfect expression of the trivial nature of our lives. And again, I don't mean that as an insult to anyone. My life's trivial just like everyone else's. The point is, what renders our life trivial is the fact that they come to an end. What renders them meaningful is the fact that I can embrace that trivial nature of life.
Having a machine that may have a better, because it's going to be programmed by the best minds that are available, will probably be, in thinking eventually, probably better thinkers than many people. Doesn't that kind of create a kind of transformative potential for AI, but also to raise it to a level where, in fact, it will be slightly humiliating for people, in so much as that it will be able to think better than they can about the problems which they're dealing with, and also it also possibly a kind of cause a kind of elitist thing in terms of a kind of higher spec. Which will be hard to conceptually grasp for the average human being or artist, in fact.
Oh, I want to come back to that elitism question in a second, but just briefly on the question of whether they think better. So we learn from our extremes. So sitting here in Cambridge, most academics don't get recognised as sort of the pinnacles of their field. I'm certainly not. But Stephen Hawking, for instance, when he was here, was seen as this great intellect. I'm not saying he was. I'm not saying he wasn't. I'm just saying that recognition of great intellect didn't make me feel less of a physicist than he was. So the fact that you might be able to capture some of that and elevate everyone to the point where we're able to engage with that is quite democratizing. It's quite it's non-elitist. The problem of elitism comes in the minute you make this part of a commercial system, whereby if you have the free version, then maybe you're stuck maybe back in 1930s quantum physics. If you are the premium payer, then you're up there with the 2020s quantum physics. You get to work out gravitational wave theory that comes into your model and so on. So suddenly now you've got better understanding of these topics. That could be a huge problem. That could lead to stratification within society. But insofar as AI can give anyone the capacity to talk meaningfully, or at least to understand and engage with the world in a certain way, great. But notice, by the way, what's valuable about that is the hybridization. It's making us better. Rather than our reliance on something else, it's me saying, oh, I don't have to learn about physics because I've got an app for that. That's a problem. Because the minute you start doing that, then you don't get any more Stephen Hawkings. You don't get any more new physics, by the way. Because again, the app can only regenerate the physics that we've actually developed. It can't give us new things. It can only regenerate the old things. But insofar as it's a learning tool, provided it is about learning and about making us be able to do and engage with, do things in the world and engage with the world in a different and more interesting way, more intelligent way, great. But at the moment, that's not what's happening. At the moment, what's happening is we're offsetting, we're trading off our cognitive and our intellectual powers to machines to take it on. Not because they can do it better, not because they want it or because they need it, but because we find it more convenient and it's saving us time to do other quote-unquote mindless things, i.e. things that don't require us to be intellectual or think failure.
looking at Shakespeare and Mozart and notions of genius, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, etc., that kind of divine spark in art. What happens with that, with AI? Because it's one of those things that always tips that debate from where did this come from? Where did this fantastically brilliant thing come from? And could it be mapped and created by artificial intelligence? Could it be reproduced? Could it be captured? Because one of those things happen.
So I'm going to do the same thing that Michelangelo did, allegedly.
Yeah.
So in the painting of the Sistine Chapel, I imagine many people are aware of this, there is a certain resemblance between the cloud that God is sitting in, reaching his finger out to touch Adam, the act of creation, right? They've likened this to a transection of the human brain. The hand reaching out is coming out of the frontal lobe. If you're interested and you want to see the image, you can just quickly Google Sistine Chapel, brain, and you'll see images of God reaching out of what looks like a brain. Now, what Michelangelo may have been doing there, and again, of course, it could be complete coincidence that it looks like this, but what he might have been doing is saying, God didn't inspire this, I did this. This is me, the artist, having created this. And I'm going to do the same move. I'm going to say, AI might look divinely quick, and it is amazingly liquid fast, but that is kind of because it's been trained on the things that we have done over a long period of time. Let me give you a really lovely example of this, actually, which a student, again, was working on with me. So they were looking at swarming drones, and to create a drone swarm, to have drones move closely together and move as a swarm of bees might move, you have to have a supercomputer orders of magnitude more powerful than anything you would have had a decade ago. Interestingly, bees operate, however, with the simplest processing possible. This is, again, my point about they don't think like us, they think like we think we think. In order to program the swarm of bees or swarm of drones to move like the bees, we have to put in billions of years of worth of code. Why? Because the bees had billions of years to develop this through evolution and development over time. So we've kind of taken a snapshot, we've kind of summarized and synthesized. We've done nothing new. We haven't created a species of animal that we've never seen before. We haven't come up with a new idea of a hybridized creature. We've just taken what we've seen and replicated it in the simplest way possible. That's all that AI is doing. And again, very convenient, but I don't see how. I mean, certainly the drones can be useful because we can fertilize fields now. If bees did go extinct, Einstein said we'd be soon afterwards, right? If bees were to go extinct, so would we. Now we don't have to worry about that because we have the tech. Again, and I'm not disparaging that. All I'm saying is it isn't this miraculous new thing that we're seeing. It's not what the word we use, neoteric. It's not genuinely novel or new. It's a rehashing of what we have before, using incredible amounts of energy, incredible amounts of thinking and cognition to replicate something that doesn't need that happens normally and naturally in nature.
Could we end up fencing with it and creating entirely new sparks of creative activity as the level is kind of raised from a kind of a non-examined type of brain being creative to a very examined one, and then that leading to flights of genius and new art in people? Could there be this kind of a complementary interaction between the artist and the machine in a way that just creates something entirely new? Is that a possibility? So
on the first point around rule following and rule imposing. So, for instance, Kant, the philosopher, said science is deriving the rule from nature. Art, creative artistic genius, is imposing a rule on nature, and that doesn't happen unnaturally. It's not divine in his view. It's just we're that part of nature that can nature, right? Can develop nature. So we put into nature something that wasn't there if we hadn't existed. Coke bottles and iPads and things like that. We can put into nature. We generate more potentiality through imposing rules on the world. If you take the rules that people have imposed on the world, a composer around the same time as Kant said, it was Debussy, said, great art makes rules. Rules don't make great art. And the problem is, therefore, if AI is rule-based, which I think it is, and I think it's unavoidably so, because even if you give it the rule, don't follow the rules, that's another rule. So it's all rule-based. And once you start doing that, it's also created by us. So it's our artifice, and it's our kind of, meddling with the boundaries of the rules that we already know are in place. So it's not really going to develop something truly surprising and novel.
AI could actually elevate
yes.
the level of thinking in creative art.
I very much like this idea that a rising tide lifts all boats, right? So the idea is that if we get AI to be another Debussy or even another Kant, or and that would challenge philosophers, artists, poets to do more to create things that go above and beyond that, to give it a new. But that typically isn't what happens. For instance, and again, this may be the wrong parallel to draw, and again, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but standardization doesn't typically lead to special standout people. I don't want to sound too much like Ayn Rand. What I'm getting at is a kind of a curriculum model of learning doesn't lead to people having flashes of genius. It does tend to be more that you have to set them on a path. Now, AI could do something like that, and typically I'm all in favour of AI-human interaction that leads to something genuinely more, that wouldn't have happened were the AI not present. Wonderful phrase used by E.M. Forster was, look before you leap is criticism's motto. Leap before you look is creativity's. And I just don't think that, I think AI, because it's all thought, it's all thinking, it's all this kind of hyper-rationalization of what we do, that the hyper-rational way in which it works means that we don't have these kind of leaps of creative fancy. So if it can enable that, and I'm not saying it can't, because again, this is how we use it as opposed to what it is. It is not creative. Can we use it to be more creative? I hope so. What I think it could do for society is free us up to be more human. I've all the way through this been saying that essentially AI is not like us and is less than us. And so the more that we give it itself and we say, look, you can do this fantastically well. The two skills that AI has that we don't have very much are perspicacity, a huge amount of perception. AI can see basically all of the internet. I can't. And cognition. It thinks incredibly quickly and with huge amounts of data going through it at once. I can't do either. I can do a minimal amount of cognition and a minimal amount of perspicacity and perception. But it has zero agency and zero passion, insight, imagination, whatever we want to call that. Alain Vital, as Bergson put it, this kind of creative spirit. So that kind of the motivators, the things that are distinctly human, that might be given to us in greater weight. It might place greater emphasis. Look at education, for instance. AI has scared a lot of institutions because they're thinking, all of our assessments need to be reassessed and kind of thrown out and redesigned. They do. That needs to happen slowly because we need to work out, what does a world with AI look like? What does a workplace with AI look like? One of the things I've noticed, for instance, is AI has often come in to replace human activity, and I think that's a huge mistake. AI should come in to enhance human activity. So, good example of this, I work with coaches, and Google has developed an AI coach. And that's a terrible idea, because firstly, I don't want to be coached by an AI, because essentially I'm coaching myself, because I will essentially just be asking it questions and looking for the kinds of answers it gives, and then kind of prodding it in the right direction, and kind of, like you do with creating an image. So, but what could happen is instead, I'm a coach and I'm writing a contract with a client. And it says, I've noticed that your client may have ADHD. Did you know that if you write the contract in the following way, it will make it easier for your client to understand? Perfect. It watches what I do, perspicacity, and it says, you could think about it in this way, and it offers you new lines of thought. That is brilliant. It's changing how I'm approaching my practice. I'm not just doing a mundane task of same contract. I'm changing the contract to my client. That's brilliant. That's what AI should be for. Hybridizing what we do. It doesn't have any qualitative leap above beyond us. And that makes perfect sense. We made it. We are imposing limits ourselves on what AI is capable of. But it can't be any other way. It can't evolve. There will be people who say neural networks can evolve, to which I respond, I have not seen any evidence of this, and until it has motivations, until it has that drive to actually want to exist or have any reason for existing, we aren't going to see an AI that challenges us. We're just not.
Dr. Alex Carter, thank you very much indeed for talking to Cambridge Radio. It's been most interesting.
Thank you, Simon.
In medieval times, if something ailed you, a great deal of thought had gone into alleviating the pain and symptoms, and these remedies laid the foundations for systematic approaches to medicine. Perhaps a corpse-derived ingredient like some skull moss would be just the ticket, but according to intelligent reasoning, Cambridge University Library's current exhibition, Curious Cures in Cambridge Libraries, is a 2-year project to digitise, catalogue and conserve over 180 medieval manuscripts and to transcribe the more than 8,000 unpublished medical recipes they contain. Medieval manuscript specialist Dr. James Freeman introduces the works, which are simply fascinating.
The exhibition has been inspired by a large-scale digitisation, cataloguing and conservation project, also called Curious Cures, which was funded by Wellcome and focused on medieval manuscripts both at the University Library and at various of the colleges and the Fitzwilliam Museum, which contain medical recipes, whether that is as their main content, they're like compilations of medical treatments, or additions in the margins or on the end leaves to both medical and non-medical books. So that has provided a really interesting cross-section of material from historic manuscript collections around the university. It also has provided us with a story about the development of medieval medicine as a discipline, as a practice, what people were trying to do, the sorts of treatments that they were attempting, as well as the logic behind it, the guiding principles that medieval people followed. Whereas the project was focused on making these important sources for the history of medicine more available to academic researchers via the digital library. What the exhibition does is make these manuscripts available to the general public, and many of them are on display for the very first time ever. This is your chance to come to the University Library and see them. They are quite texty, I won't lie. There aren't that many illustrations or that much illumination, but the contents are absolutely fascinating, and I'm hoping that I've been able to tell a really engaging and thought-provoking story with them.
It's wonderful to see what people believed in the medieval era, and also the artwork in some of the... I was looking at the artwork, and it's absolutely amazing artwork in some of those manuscripts.
There are several diagrams that encapsulate important principles or ideas in medieval medicine. Of course, most people will probably have heard of the four humours. So we have a manuscript on loan to us from Trinity College that shows, it's like a sort of 4x4 diagram that explains to the reader the influence of your age or the season upon your humoral balance, essentially. There are also anatomical diagrams on display, some of the earliest surviving from Western Europe, so dating to the late 12th, early 13th century in a manuscript that's on loan to us from Gonville and Keyes. And we also have a copy of a surgical treatise by a famous English surgeon of the 14th century called John Ardern, which is very unusual in surgical writings of the time in providing illustrations of the procedure which Ardern devised to treat anal fistulas. Apologies to everybody. It's quite graphic, I won't lie. What I hope visitors to the exhibition will see in the manuscripts that are on display are medieval people thinking, learning and writing, attempting to understand disease and its causes, and trying out a frankly bewildering array of treatments for all sorts of ailments and illnesses. You're quite right, there are guiding principles and a logical framework, a rational framework, within which all of this is situated, or much of it at least. And medieval medicine is about following that framework, which they had inherited from the ancient world through intermediary translations from the original Greek into Arabic, and then from Arabic into Latin. And educated physicians who were studying at the universities further refined and elaborated upon this system. But alongside that, you have these empirical treatments, which were known to be, or thought to be effective, which is a sort of more practice-based, and there probably was experimentation, trialling and testing. Certainly there are annotations in the manuscripts which will say things like proven or beware, like this is dangerous. We also have case notes from practitioners who we know, which say that they had witnessed particular treatments being performed successfully, or others that they had devised themselves, I should say.
So they were methodical about what they were doing. How much of an obstacle was the fact that they weren't allowed to do dissections of dead bodies to find out what was actually going on inside the human body?
It's something of an obstacle for sure. So the role of the physician is to understand your physica, your internal nature, so the four humours and what's going on there. And they did this by looking at your urine for its colour, texture, smell, even taste. Dreadful to think of, though that is. And also examining your pulse. And what would result would be a treatment that the physician would tailor to the patient. As I mentioned before, there are these diagrams, these anatomical illustrations, which show different systems of the body that they knew existed, such as, and there were 5 of them. These were the nerves, arteries, veins, bones and muscles. But what the image in this series of illustrations show are essentially distillations of the theories that Galen, who was alive in the 2nd and early 3rd century AD, had described. Galen did dissections, but not on people, but on animals. Animals, particularly primates, but also dogs, whose anatomies he considered to be similar to our own. And you're quite right, these persist right through the medieval period, and it's really only in the early 14th century that dissections begin again, but very slowly and only in isolated instances. So there's a particular surgeon, physician in Bologna called Mondino de Luzzi, and he does one of the first dissections to take place in medieval Europe since Hellenistic Greece. And he writes a treatise that describes a sort of step-by-step process for doing dissections. Now, when we do a changeover halfway through the exhibition, because we can't have these objects on display at the same opening for continuing for like 8 months, because they'll fade and it can damage them, we're swapping an item into the first case, which shows the slow progress that dissection followed. It will be a printed book from the 1530s from Germany, written by somebody called Johann Dryander, who was a teacher at the University of Mainz, and it describes the process by which you dissect a head. And the final illustration shows a skull or a head with the layers of flesh peeled back, more or less accurately, the cranial sutures underneath, again, more or less accurately, from the dissections that Dryander himself had conducted. But included in that diagram are also things that he had read about but cannot possibly have seen, including a network of blood vessels in the forehead, which Galen had seen in dogs, but which does not exist in humans, as well as the location of different types of cognition in separate, physically discrete cells in the brain, which is something that medieval and early modern readers inherited from Aristotle, I think. So their understanding of what was happening in the body was limited, or defined rather, by the theory of the humours, what they observed by examining people's pulse or urine, and the inferences that they drew from that.
Can you describe some of the curious cures that they came up with? Just give me a few examples of the kind of cures that they would have come up with their theory.
Sure. One of the pleasures of the Curious Cures project has been reading the recipes. It's not often that we have the time to delve really into the detail, but the interest, the devil is in the detail, and that's where these sorts of interesting sorts of discoveries can be made. And we wanted with the exhibition to share that experience with our visitors, so we have provided translations of recipes that appear on the openings that are on display, so that you can see the writer's hand before your eyes, as it were, and step into their world and into their mind for a brief moment. So some of these I would definitely not try at home, but others seem fairly harmless. There's one that recommends treating wrinkles by crushing wild cucumber in water and then washing your face with that for 3 days. I mean, that sounds rather like a kind of beauty treatment that people might get for themselves nowadays. There are others that suggest treating beardlessness. If you want a beard to grow on your face, you gather these calluses that grow on donkeys' legs but which fall off at certain times of the year in winter, I think. And you burn these and mix them with something else, can't quite remember what, and you rub it on your face, and apparently it is of such potency that it will work even on women. There are ones which... The ones for gout are often the most elaborate and improbable, because there is no cure for gout that's known in the medieval period, and the types of people who suffer from it are wealthy because they're eating a rich diet that has lots of meat, and thus they are able to pay for treatments that become ever more complicated and use ever more obscure ingredients. So I won't give away too much there, because they're in the case at the end, so I definitely recommend you come and have a look at them for yourself.
So they saw the body as a system attached to the elements,
That's right.
and also theoretically to soul beliefs and astrology and all kinds of other things.
Yes.
So that they saw it as having all kinds of forces acting upon the body. Are there good parts to any of these theories that stand up in modern medicine? Are there any things that they particularly discovered as actually pivotal in medical science?
Well, I might have a doctorate, but I'm not a medical doctor. So I don't. Please, anybody who is listening, don't follow what I might relate in this interview. Probably the thing that comes closest to the sorts of advice that we follow for healthy living, or wellness as it's often branded these days, is the health regimen. And this was a distinct genre of medical text in the medieval period that advised about controlling what were called the non-naturals. So these are external factors that act upon the body, but which can affect, for better or worse, your humoral balance within. So if your humours are in balance, you're well, but if they're out of balance, or if one humour is concentrated in a particular body where it shouldn't, part of the body where it shouldn't be, or has become corrupted in some way, then that's what causes disease. And medieval people thought that if you had a balanced diet, according to their ideas, you sort of monitored the food and drink that you were consuming, had a good night's sleep and that sort of thing, exercised and rested, controlled your emotions, had a healthy sort of system of excretion and retention, and they also had some instructions on bathing or sexual intercourse when you should have it and that sort of thing. That would help you to control your internal humoral balance through monitoring these non-naturals.
It wasn't just physicians. You had nurses and priests and apothecaries, and lots of people dealt in your heart, body, mind, and soul during that era, didn't they? So
Quite right.
There was a lot of input.
Much like nowadays, people sought medical advice and medical treatments from a wide range of constituencies. The highest learning made the best medicine. So if you were wealthy, you could pay for a highly educated physician to look after you. But most people, that was not an option for them. Instead, what we see in the manuscripts are members of the religious orders, including the Augustinian canons at Barnwell Priory, for instance, just on the outskirts of medieval Cambridge. We see barbers and practitioners of the healing arts, or leechcraft as it's sometimes called, practicing medicine. We see examples of women practicing medicine or devising recipes, or recipes are attributed to them. And the simplicity of many of the herbal remedies that we see in the manuscripts, they use common plants that could be found freely almost anywhere. They use cheap and readily available ingredients like milk, honey, wine, beer, that sort of thing. And they use simple preparatory equipment that you would find in anybody's home, because it would be used for cooking your dinner, say. So things for chopping, stamping, grinding, boiling, stewing, all of that sort of stuff. That all points to the fact that even ordinary men and women in the household are trying some of these remedies. Of course, we're reliant on the written word for our understanding of what happened in the medieval period. But it's clear that a lot of medical knowledge was being passed around orally. But of course that doesn't survive, so we are relying on the manuscripts that tell us what information was known and what was being passed around at second, third, fourth hand.
And those would be considered to be highly valuable and quite rare, those manuscripts, because they were circulating all over Europe, weren't they? And people really valued those books.
They are expensive to produce. Even the ones that look the scruffiest and the cheapest would have been beyond the means of the majority of people. Nevertheless, they contain the sorts of simple remedies that might have been gathered from lay practitioners, and one of the interesting dimensions in the project is the role that members of the mendicant religious orders, so friars like Dominicans, Franciscans and Carmelites, played in the study and practice of medicine among lay people. Friars, unlike Benedictines, lived out in the world. They relied on charitable alms and donations from the public for their upkeep, which they earned by preaching and acting as confessors. And this gave them privileged access to people's homes and brought them into contact with ordinary people on a regular basis. Evidently, the friars are picking up recipes from ordinary people, and I've got an example of a ritual to protect you from toothache on display in the exhibition, which you can come and read about. But they are also engaging in care of women as well. So there is a compilation of medical treatments that was put together by members of the Franciscan order in the early 15th century. It's called the Tabula Medicinae. There are sections within that deal with such matters as pregnancy and labour, infertility, care of postpartum mothers. Evidently, the friars were taking a really detailed interest in this, and they're having contact with women that was not necessarily unproblematic at the time. The members of the religious orders ought not to be mixing, in strictly speaking, in this way, but they were clearly.
Were these physicians more likely to do you an injury or kill you than cure you?
I think the perception of rates of mortality in the medieval period are skewed by the fact that if you have a low life expectancy on average, people tend to assume that that means everybody died before they were 35. What it actually means is that large numbers of people may have died when they were infants or children, but if you got past that and into adulthood, you could potentially live for decades thereafter. I mean, I wouldn't recommend doing any of the things that you might read about in the manuscripts. And the surgical treatments that are described seem particularly risky, given that there are no antiseptics or antibiotics at this time. Those procedures must have been fraught with risk. But it's interesting that somebody like John Ardern, who I mentioned earlier, who was a bit of a self-publicist, I think it's fair to say, claimed to have devised a way to treat anal fistulas in such a way that he had a very low rate of mortality by contemporary standards. But some of the ingredients were probably, harmful in some of the remedies that you might read about. Others probably just simply ineffective. And we don't really know how medieval people responded to the failure of physicians or medical practitioners to treat them. There is in one of the manuscripts on display a short poem on just two lines that is as a kind of anti-physician little saying, where it says that essentially, priests will come and hear your confession even if you can't pay, but doctors won't treat you if you can't cough up the money. In terms of a sort of masterpiece, probably one of the nicest manuscripts that's on display is an illuminated copy of the Regime du Corps, a text written in the mid-13th century by somebody called Aldobrandino of Siena, an educated physician, for his patron Beatrice of Savoy, a noblewoman. And rather than writing in Latin, Aldobrandino wrote in French. So this is a language that Beatrice would have read and understood and spoken at court. It's the language of the European aristocratic and royal courts in this time. And it deals with matters of health regimen, so all of those non-naturals that I mentioned earlier. And the copy that we have at the University Library was made a couple of centuries later, in the mid-15th century, and each chapter begins with a little historiated initial, so a little vignette, a little scene that relates to the contents of the chapter that follows. And so it's a very beautiful object, as well as containing lots of interesting advice and insights about medieval health. And in particular, it has sections that deal with those subjects that are of obvious concern to royal and aristocratic families, which are courtship and sex, pregnancy, care of postpartum mothers and newborns, the continuation of the family line. And this copy, we know from a coat of arms that has been painted into the front of it, later belonged to Elizabeth of York, the wife of Henry VII, King of England, and the mother of Henry VIII. So evidently, women in the medieval period, they're not only patrons of medicine, like Beatrice commissioning this work to be written, they are also practitioners, they're also readers. So one might imagine Elizabeth of York reading this book and following the advice that is given, or having it read to her. I think that's one of the star items on the show.
What did ritual healing involve?
So in the medieval period, magic and science are blended together. They don't exist as they do nowadays in separate, even opposing spheres. And one of the cases in the exhibition shows manuscripts that contain charms and ritual magic, this sort of magical, semi-magical kind of practices that were thought to have curative properties. So, and these are dotted also around they pop up in other parts of the exhibition as well. So one of the examples elsewhere is of a ritual against toothache that a friar copied into his notebook. This friar is called Richard Tennant, and he says that if you clip each of your fingernails and each of your toenails and say at each clipping a Paternoster and an Ave Maria, two common prayers, and then after every fifth one you say a Paternoster, an Ave Maria and a Credo, then you gather up all of the clippings in a clean linen cloth and bury this in an elder tree, you'll be protected from from toothache. And he writes down that he learned this off John Lymington, who was another Carmelite friar, who himself had learned it off an old woman. So evidently the friars, they're talking to people and they're writing these things down. Going back to the magical remedies, the logic for these is not always, well, in fact, it's rarely explained. So you have to interpret the text that's written down. So one of the manuscripts that we've on display shows a charm against fevers. And in the medieval period, fevers are a disease in their own right. They're not a symptom. And they're thought to be the result of a disordered digestive system, which results in the body overheating. And what this charm involves you doing, or the healer doing, is making signs of the cross, saying a formulaic phrase, and then getting the patient's hand and writing on their palm the words of the Holy Trinity interspersed with crosses, and then washing that off, and then getting the patient to drink that water. And they repeat this with a couple of other different phrases, all of which point to harmony and balance and things existing in kind of coexisting harmoniously. And I think the logic behind it is that you ingest the healing power of these words directly, and that sort of balances out what's going on inside you. I mean, obviously it did not work, but there might have been a placebo effect, perhaps. And I wonder whether there's a placebo effect with the ritual against toothache. You're too busy clipping your fingernails and saying all these prayers that you sort of forget about the pain in your mouth. Physicians were also making astrological observations because they believed that the timing of interventions like bloodletting or surgery should be determined by the conjunction of planetary bodies. So each part of the body was ruled by a sign of the zodiac, from Aries in the head right through to Pisces in the feet. If the moon was in conjunction with that corresponding constellation, then it was considered a perilous time to operate on that part of the body. So, and there are other ideas about the coincidence between solar phases and chronic disease and lunar phases and acute disease, and physicians were using instruments like volvelles and astrolabes to track these movements, identify stars and planets in the night sky. There's a lot of complex mathematical calculation going on behind this, as well as this sort of more, to our minds, slightly off-beam, astrological zodiac sign kind of stuff.
So they've gone in all these different directions. What would they do when there was a success with something that they had that they'd cooked up as a remedy? Would they celebrate that? So
certainly we see some physicians in the manuscripts that they owned or that they wrote themselves making records of what they were doing. And we've been loaned a manuscript for the exhibition by the Bodleian Library in Oxford, for which we're very grateful. And it is a notebook that was owned and compiled by somebody called John Argentine. And he was a physician, born in Bottisham originally. He studied at King's College under two other physicians, one called William Hatcliffe and another called William Ordew. And he goes abroad, as many physicians did, to somewhere, we don't know precisely where, but it was probably in Italy or southern France, to a more renowned centre for medical study. And then he comes back to Cambridge later in the 15th century and establishes a successful practice before then going on to be physician to a series of members of the royal family right up to Henry VII and Prince Arthur. And Argentine writes this compilation of remedies, most of which he's culled from other sources, but which includes treatments he devised himself or which he'd seen other people use successfully. So these included a treatment for gonorrhea, which he had devised himself and which he used with apparent success on a man in Cambridge in 1474, he writes down, a man who had suffered major discharges for more than a year, which sounds terribly uncomfortable. And he also writes down a recipe for a restorative, which he had seen his teacher, William Ordew, use successfully on a rector in a nearby place, whom everybody else had written off as dead, and everybody else had said he couldn't be cured. But what Ordew did was take an old cockerel, place it in a distillatory, a kind of alchemical flask, cooked it down, and then made the rector drink of the resulting liquid. I mean, it sounds like chicken soup, doesn't it? And apparently the recovery of health began very quickly, and this said rector lived for many years thereafter. So evidently observation is being conducted and records are being made. But the reason why these empirical remedies might have been effective wasn't necessarily wholly understood. So that's going back to that point I was making about rational medicine against empirical medicine. We live in a world where empirical medicine, trialing, testing, doing pharmaceutical research, all of that sort of stuff is integral to modern day medicine. So in the medieval period, it's sort of the other way around. If it fits within the rational framework, then that's proper medicine.
So, I mean, it seems to me that the thing that they really did contribute was establishing medical practice, even though it could have been all wrong. The fact is they started this methodical process of looking at it all and documenting it all.
Exactly. There is a method, there is a process and a procedure. It's not the procedure that we follow nowadays. That's really a kind of development of the 18th century and the new sort of scientific method. But they were clearly curious, they were clearly intelligent and thoughtful people. They took great care to distill the knowledge that they possessed in forms that were accessible and could be consulted easily, whether that is organising it in head-to-toe order or in alphabetical order or by the different systems of the body, and enormous amounts of energy and effort and curiosity, I suppose, are being expended on trying to understand how the body worked and to try to cure disease. Were they always successful? No, far from it, but modern medicine has still a long way to go, and I imagine in 8 or 9 or 10 centuries people will look back at what we were doing in the 20th and 21st century and say, oh my goodness, what on earth were they thinking? Because that is how science and medicine developed through a continuous process of learning and experimenting. Evidently medieval people were doing some of that too.
That was absolutely wonderful. Dr. James Freeman, thank you very much indeed for talking to Cambridge Radio.
So the exhibition is free. There's no charge, and it's open until the 6th of December this year. We encourage people to book tickets because it sometimes gets quite busy downstairs, but if you want to turn up, that's also fine.
Well, that brings us to the end of this edition of Cambridge Arts Roundup. I hope it's been both curative and interesting enough for you to want to tune in again on Cambridge Radio. I'm Simon Bertin, and I'll be back with more on Creative Cambridge soon.